The Right Side with Doug Billings.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show. Doug Billings here on The Right Side. Thanks for joining me. No matter where you are around the planet, we're here, you and I, shoulder to shoulder. So today on the program, who really controls your health, your money, and your children's minds? That's what we're going to talk about. From the United States walking away from the World Health Organization, again, under President Trump, and the Supreme Court stepping into decisions involving the Federal Reserve. What's going on there? Plus, the digital systems that are shaping the next generation of children. This is about sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen, in the modern era. And The Right Side with Doug Billings is now upon you. Are you ready? Let's go.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.
Hey everybody, my name is General Mike Flynn, and I'm here to do a big shout out for my great friend and one of the best in the business, Mr. Doug Billings. Right Side with Doug Billings, Right Side with Doug Billings. Doug is the future of the airwaves when it comes to independent broadcasters and podcasters. He is the new Rush Limbaugh. He's exactly what America needs right now, looking for honesty, looking for wisdom, looking for truth, looking for patriotism. Listen to Doug Billings at Right Side with Doug Billings. God bless you and God bless America, and thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are winning. We're winning, winning, winning. Welcome to The Right Side with Doug Billings. Are you ready?
We are not liberal snowflakes who melt away in the face of tragedy, adversity, and challenge. We are a covenant nation under God, and His divine providence is not dead and it's not gone. It is living within each and every one of you. And you will bring it to life in such a way that the world has never seen before. We never back down. We never give up. We march forward.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Right Side with Doug Billings. Appreciate you all being here. A word that gets thrown around a lot, but almost never explained thoroughly enough, and we say it without really thinking about everything that it means. Sovereignty. Most people think sovereignty means borders and flags, maps or troops and treaties, or a combination thereof, right? But sovereignty at its core is something much simpler and, by the way, something much more powerful. It's who gets to make the final decision when things go wrong. Okay, think of that in terms of sovereignty. And today, the United States is making a statement about that very thing by officially moving to exit the World Health Organization, the WHO, ladies and gentlemen. Now, let me slow it down because it's important to remember and to comment fully and effectively that this is not about doctors, it's not about nurses, it's not about vaccines. This is about authority. This is about controlling crisis. This is about who governs America when fear tries to enter into the room. That's what this is all about. And it doesn't take much to have a flashback back to the times where we didn't have authority. And it was taken away because other presidents with other agendas were in the Oval Office. So let's define what the WHO actually is. It is a United Nations agency, first of all, right? Founded by dozens of countries around the planet, guided by international committees, panels, political blocs, not elected by American voters, obviously, not accountable to American courts, and not bound by the United States Constitution. And yet, during global emergencies, it doesn't just give advice, it influences national policy. It sets global standards, and it pressures governments through trade and diplomacy, reputation. When you put all of that together, I mean, that's power, ladies and gentlemen. That's a powerful organization, not military power, narrative power, norm-setting power, moral authority power. And the United States is now saying we're stepping back and away and out of that system. So here's what the headlines are going to tell you. They say that this is about unpaid fees, it's about legal hurdles, and this is about bureaucratic process. Okay, but what's really happening is much deeper than any of that. America is reasserting the idea that no international institution gets to outrank the consent of the American people. Let me ask you something. When the next global emergency happens, and there will be one, who should decide what happens in the town and in the county and in the state in which you live? Should it be your local officials, your state government, your elected federal representatives, or a committee based in Geneva? Because that's the real question behind the story, my friends. Here's how global institutions actually gain power. Not through an invasion, not through conquest, but through crisis. Every emergency creates a vacuum. And whoever steps into the role of to coordinate during the time of that crisis becomes the authority. First, they advise. That's how it always begins. Let's just give them advice. Then they recommend. Then they set expectations. And then they define what's reasonable or what's dangerous. And pretty soon, disagreement doesn't just make you wrong, it makes you irresponsible. And that's how soft power will harden into something very, very hard. Let me be clear about this, ladies and gentlemen. It's not an argument against cooperation. We are all about cooperation. Hard power, the power that can change lives and modify the way that you behave, that's something else. America should cooperate, absolutely. America should lead, and America should research, share the research materials, the results, share resources, share medical breakthroughs. All of that is glaringly obvious. But there's a difference between partnership and permission. There's a difference between leadership and submission. And the line between those two gets very blurry when institutions stop answering to the people that they affect. Think about how this plays out in real life. When a global body issues a guideline, it doesn't just stand on a desk, this guideline. It travels through corporate policies, school systems, hospital networks, airlines, insurance companies, tech platforms, all around the planet. Suddenly, a recommendation becomes a requirement. Not because of law, mind you, but because of systems. And systems are often harder to fight than governments are. That's why sovereignty isn't loud. It doesn't march. It doesn't chant. It doesn't trend on social media. Sovereignty shows up in who signs the final order, who puts their signature on that final order, who gets to say, yes, we will, or no, we won't, who gets to say, yep, this applies, or no, that doesn't apply. That's where freedom lives, ladies and gentlemen, in that last decision. So let's talk about the argument that you'll hear from the other side. They're going to say that this weakens America, that we have stepped out of the World Health Organization. But let me flip that. A country that cannot say no, is not strong, ladies and gentlemen. A country that's got to always comply, has to always be in good standing, is not sovereign. Real leadership doesn't come from being the best follower in the room. It comes from being the standard setter. And here's the strategic question for the United States. Do we want to be one voice among many, or the nations others look to when things fall apart? Because those two are very different roles, very different responsibilities. And here's what doesn't get talked about enough. The who isn't just medical. It's political, it's economic, it's diplomatic. And health policy affects trade, travel, manufacturing, labor, education, national security, and a health designation can shut down supply chains. A travel advisory can collapse tourism. A classification can reshape global perception of a country overnight. And that's not just medicine, ladies and gentlemen. That's geopolitics right there. So when America steps away, it's not retreating from the world. It's saying something very specific to the world. We will cooperate, but we will not outsource our judgment. So let me bring this home for us, because this doesn't live in headlines, ladies and gentlemen. It lives in kitchens. It lives in school board meetings, and it lives in hospitals. It lives in small businesses that either get to stay open or they're told that they're non-essential. Remember that word? Non-essential. Who decides that? You see, that's sovereignty. And what makes this moment so important is what's coming later in the show today, because it's not just about health. In the next block of this show, we're going to talk about money, specifically who controls it, who protects it, and who answers for it when it fails. Because whether it's your body, whether it's your bank account, or your child's mind, the question is always the same. Who gets the final say? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the right side. This is how we roll. And when we come back, I'm gonna step into a Supreme Court battle that could redefine the relationship between the American people, the President of the United States, and the most powerful financial institution in the world, our Federal Reserve. And I think it's worth talking about. The Supreme Court, the Federal Reserve. Who controls your money? Because if we just talked about who controls your health during a crisis, this section of the show is about something just as personal. And in many ways, it's just as powerful, if not more so. Who controls your money? Not the bills that you have to pay, not the money that's in your wallet necessarily, but not the numbers that are in your bank app, but the invisible system that decides how expensive your mortgage is going to be, whether your credit card grows or shrinks, how much your savings account will be worth next year, and how your paycheck actually, how far it goes at the grocery store. And right now, the Supreme Court of the United States is being asked to weigh in on a question that has seriously been ignored, hasn't been tested at all in over a century. Can the President of the United States remove a sitting governor of the Federal Reserve? That's the question. Now, let's take a look at it, because this is one of those stories that gets buried under legal jargon and economic language. And most Americans are never told why it actually matters in their lives if this can be done or not, if a president can remove a governor of the Federal Reserve. So, in case you're from Raytown, Missouri, let's just look at what is the Federal Reserve. It's not a bank in the way that you think of a normal bank. It doesn't take deposits. It doesn't give you a checking account. The Federal Reserve is the central nervous system of the American economy. Okay? It controls interest rates, money supply, lending conditions, emergency funding for banks and institutions, and in simple terms, it decides how easy or how difficult it's going to be to move money through the economy. And when money moves easily, businesses expand, people borrow, and homes get built. When money tightens, everything slows down. Jobs, housing, investment, growth, all slow. Now, there's a tradition. For over 100 years, the Federal Reserve has been treated as independent, okay, meaning that it doesn't answer directly to the White House. It doesn't take daily political direction from Congress. Its governors serve fixed terms, protected from being fired for political reasons. The idea itself is fairly simple. If politicians controlled interest rates, they could lower them before elections, juice the economy, and pass the bill on to the next administration. So the system was designed to put a wall between political power and monetary power. And now that wall is being tested in the court. The case before the Supreme Court centers on Lisa Cook. She is a sitting governor on the Federal Reserve Board, and the president attempted to remove her, citing misconduct and various other legal concerns. And the legal question is not whether or not you like her. It's not whether you trust her. The question is this: does the Constitution give the president the authority to fire leaders of so-called independent agencies? Or are those agencies insulated, even from the elected head of the executive branch? Let me translate all of that into real-world language. If the court says the president can remove a Federal Reserve governor, it means that the Federal Reserve becomes more accountable to elected leadership. But it also means that the Federal Reserve becomes more vulnerable to political pressure. If the court says the president can't remove a Federal Reserve governor, it means the Federal Reserve remains insulated from politics. But it also means that one of the most powerful economic institutions in the world remains largely insulated from you, the voters. So this is the tension: stability versus accountability, independence versus democracy, expertise versus consent. And this is not an academic debate. This is about who ultimately answers to you. I'll give you an example. When inflation hits, and when it hits suddenly, your groceries cost more, your rent goes up, your car payment jumps, your savings lose value. Who do you hold responsible? The president, Congress, or the Federal Reserve? Because right now the Fed can make decisions that affect every household in America without ever appearing on a ballot. And to be fair, there's a reason that this system exists. Markets don't like chaos, not one bit, and investors don't like uncertainty. Businesses don't like sudden political swings, and the idea behind Fed independence is to create predictability, a steady hand on the wheel regardless of who wins an election. That's the idea, and that stability is part of the reason why the dollar remains a global reserve currency. But as always, there's always two sides to a coin, right? The other side to this coin is stability without accountability can become detachment, and detachment can turn into distance, and distance can turn into disconnection from the real economy that people live in. To put it another way, when a factory closes in a small town, the Federal Reserve doesn't see the town. It sees a data point, okay? When a family can't afford a home, the Federal Reserve doesn't see the family. It sees a housing index. If you're retired and if your retirement savings shrink, the Fed doesn't see a lifetime of work. It sees a bond market adjustment. That doesn't make them evil, these people that sit on the Federal Reserve Board. It makes them institutional. And institutions by design think in systems, not in human stories. So the Supreme Court now stands in the middle of a philosophical crossroads. Should the people, through their elected president, have a direct line of authority into our central bank? Or should the central bank remain a technocratic institution shielded from the political winds of our times? And here's where the issue gets even bigger. This case doesn't just affect the Federal Reserve. If the court expands presidential removal power, it could ripple across regulatory agencies, commissions, boards, bureaucracies. It could reshape how much control the executive branch itself has over the entire administrative state. And it is not about one one who sits at the Fed. It's not about just one person. It's not about one seat. This is about the architecture of American governance. And let me tie it back to what we began speaking about in this program. Health institutions, financial institutions, all of them operate at the same space. They are powerful, they're permanent, and they often, very often, outlast administrations. And they shape the daily life of everyone in the United States more than most laws that are passed by Congress. This is the bureaucracy that you've seen President Trump in many ways reduce so significantly, especially when the government shut itself down last year. Bureaucrats can control your life more than the laws that are passed in Congress. So the real question is, in a constitutional republic, should power flow upward to permanent institutions, or should it flow outward from the people? Because once power becomes permanent, it rarely becomes humble. Now, to be perfectly clear, there is no perfect answer here, because political control can lead to abuse, and institutional insulation can lead to arrogance. The American system was built to live in tension, not in resolution. You have to understand that. The American system was built to live within tension, not resolution. Checks, balances, push, pull. That's friction. It's not a flaw. It is a feature of our form of government. But what matters is that you know that this is happening. That's why I want to talk with you about this today. Because when a Supreme Court decision comes down, the headlines are going to be short, but the consequences will be very long. They'll show up, these consequences will show up in interest rates, lending standards, credit markets, inflation policy, and economic confidence across the economy. In other words, they will show up, ladies and gentlemen, in your life. Well, I want to switch gears a bit. I want to talk about what's going on in other parts of the world. It affects us here, what's going on. Iran specifically, terrible tragedy. Iran's days are numbered. Their government is numbered. They've got, proxies, minions. They've got drug lords. They've got tribal leaders. They export chaos. They test American resolve. They're doing it again. They're acting up. We've talked about institutions in this program today, and money and power. But power that doesn't wear a uniform, ladies and gentlemen. In the modern world, conflict doesn't always come, with tanks rolling across a border. Sometimes it comes with militias. Sometimes it comes with fighter cells, sleeper cells. Sometimes it arrives in networks of fighters who don't belong to any one country, but answer to one regime. And right now, the Iranian government is leaning heavily into that very model. So let's define what we mean when we say proxy warfare. What does that mean? A proxy is a force that fights on your behalf without your flag on their shoulder, all right? So they're not officially in your army. They don't march under your banner, but they move in your interests. They disrupt your enemies, they advance your influence, and if something goes wrong, you get to be able to deny responsibility. It's power with plausible deniability is basically what it is. And Iran has built an entire regional strategy around that idea. Instead of protecting power with its own military, it builds and it funds and it trains and it supplies aligned militias across the Middle East. So they've got groups in Iraq, in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and well beyond those places. These groups don't just fight, ladies and gentlemen, they shape politics and they intimidate governments and they pressure United States allies and they test American red lines. Now, here's why this matters so much to you in the middle of the heartland, whether you live in Kansas, Missouri, Texas, or anywhere else. Because when instability spreads in the Middle East, it doesn't stay there. It affects global oil prices, shipping routes, international markets, refugee flows, terror networks, and U.S. military posture. Every ripple turns into a wave when stuff goes on in the Middle East. And I can walk you through the strategy. Iran doesn't want a direct war with the United States. Oh, they'll talk a big game. That would be catastrophic for them. So instead, they operate in this gray zone. They push here, they test there, they escalate just enough to gain ground, but not enough to trigger a full-scale response. It's like leaning on a fence. Not trying to knock it down, just seeing how far it bends, right? So the militias act as early warning systems, pressure points, and bargaining chips in a lot of ways. And if Iran wants leverage, especially in negotiations, tensions begin to rise. If Iran wants relief from sanctions, things suddenly calm down. Conflict becomes a dial that Iran can turn up or down depending on their circumstances and what they want to get out of their circumstances. So let's talk about what this does to American credibility, because deterrence isn't about giving a speech. It's about expectation. If a regime expects that crossing a line will be met with consequences, they think twice. If they expect hesitation or debate or a speech or a delay of any kind, they keep pushing. That's why proxy warfare is so dangerous. It creates ambiguity. Was that attack state-sponsored? Was that group acting independently? Was that an accident or an intended message? You know what I mean? So while lawyers and diplomats debate definitions, facts on the ground change. Positions shift. Territory gets contested and influence grows. So then there's the human cost to all of this, which has been incredibly horrific, because behind every militia headline that you read, there are cities that are caught in the middle. There are families that are displaced, infrastructure that's destroyed, and an entire region is locked then in a cycle of retribution, of retaliation. As it turns out, proxy wars don't end. They linger, and they turn conflicts into unfortunate and deadly permanent conditions. And that's the uncomfortable truth about what's happening in Iran. America's enemies watch not just what we do, but how fast we do it. Speed signals resolve, and delay signals doubt. It's a difference between, Biden and Trump come to mind for me automatically. Biden would appease our enemies and never act quickly, and it caused the rest of the world to doubt our resolve. Trump's the exact opposite. Oh boy, is he resolved, and wow, does he act fast. And so in a world of instant communication, hesitation becomes visible. So So what does our American first strategy look like in that kind of an environment? It doesn't mean chasing every militia across the desert, by the way. It means clear red lines, predictable consequences, strong alliances, and visible strength. Because deterrence only works when it is believable, ladies and gentlemen. Let me break down the tools in this. I'm not talking about slogans. I'm not talking about sound bites. Tools, okay? Sanctions that target money, okay? The way that money flows. Not just the money that belongs to public figures, but then there's intelligence partnerships that disrupt networks before they move, right? Regional alliances that share the burden of the stability that they want to achieve, and then defending and positioning, defensive positioning that protects things like shipping lanes, airspace, and the infrastructure within any given country. That's not, it's not about conquest. It's about really the containment of chaos. And this ties back to what we were talking about earlier. Health institutions, financial institutions, security institutions, all three operate in a system of trust. When trust breaks down, markets will begin to wobble, undoubtedly. Alliances will begin to strain, and conflict will begin to spread. You can count on it. Stability isn't built in isolation. It is built in credibility. Now, a lot of things don't get said enough in the media these days. Here's one of those things. Weakness doesn't invite peace, all right? It invites competition. And competition in unstable regions of the world often turns into real conflict real quickly. In plain terms, if America steps back, somebody else is going to step forward. And that someone else is not always a country that shares our values, not always a friend, not a country that often shares our laws or our vision or our ideas of what human dignity really is. Power abhors a vacuum, doesn't like it. And I want to bring the global conversation home because the same question that we're asking about the Middle East, we have to ask about the United States. Who enforces the law here? And who sets the rules? And what happens when authority is challenged from the inside? Domestic activism, federal authority, and why internal stability is not a political issue. It is a national security issue. And we're seeing it play out, aren't we, in America? I think domestic law, federal authority, internal stability, national security. One state, Minnesota, comes to mind immediately, doesn't it? What happens when authority is challenged from the inside? Because here's a truth that most people don't want to confront. A nation that cannot enforce its own laws becomes vulnerable everywhere else. And that's, I think you'll agree, part of the liberal agenda. Let me start with a story that on the surface looks local. In Minnesota, an alleged ringleader behind a mob that stormed a church, I'm sure you all heard the story, during an anti-ICE action was arrested. Okay, so a community organizer, a paid organizer. Now, depending on what media you follow, this gets framed as protest, activism, civil disobedience. But let me tell you, and let's look together at what really happened. This was not a sign. It wasn't a chant. It wasn't a march on a sidewalk. It was direct confrontation with federal law enforcement. And when federal authority is physically challenged, it comes across very simply as crossing a line from politics into governance. And here's why that matters, my friends. Federal agencies exist because the Constitution creates a national government, not just a collection of states. There are areas where federal law is supreme. Borders, immigration, national security, interstate commerce, okay? You can debate policy. You can argue priorities, but when the enforcement itself becomes a target, the system starts to crack. So widen the lens a little bit with me. Look at what's happening in now Virginia, where a series of legislative and executive actions are being pushed that critics argue that would weaken law enforcement, reduce penalties, and reshape criminal justice standards in that state, and possibly ripple out throughout the country. Supporters will call it reform. Of course they will. And opponents call it retreat. But here's the key point. Regardless of where you land politically on this issue, policy shapes behavior. There's no doubt about that. Laws don't just punish, they signal. They tell people what a society tolerates. They tell criminals what risks are worth taking, and they communicate whether the system is on their side or not. And this is where internal stability becomes a national security issue, because criminal behavior networks don't respect city limits. They could care less. They don't respect county lines. They don't respect state borders. They move through transportation corridors, through work enforcement zones, and through jurisdictional confusion, because we don't know what jurisdiction is this. I don't know. So the criminals have a field day because a lot of people don't know the boundaries. Now, when one area there becomes soft, it becomes a hub. And I'll connect it back to what we talked about in the Middle East. Just like foreign regimes use proxy militias to test American resolve, domestic actors who are paid or not to show up and become these kind of professional protesters, domestic actors will test the authority of the United States here at home. And you can see it play out in front of us. They push, they see what happens, they escalate if nothing happens, and the pattern becomes the same. The scale is a little bit different, but the pattern's the same. And then you've got people usually on the radical liberal left who will create bailout funds and GoFundMe accounts for the criminals so they can get right back out on the streets again. Federalism. We have to talk about it. A word that, we talk about federalism, don't we? And I think that if you were honest, we would all admit that since we don't teach civics in schools anymore, federalism isn't really a word that's explained thoroughly enough. The United States was built on a layered system of authority. Local, state, and federal. Each level has its own role, and each level has its limits. The system works when those layers cooperate. It breaks down when they collide, when they don't cooperate. So the balance, how do you get there? Local governments handle community needs. States shape regional policies, okay? And the federal government protects national interests. Immigration enforcement sits right in that third category. It's not a neighborhood issue. It is not a county issue. It is a national issue. And I want to be really clear, this is not about being anti-protest, not at all. Americans have the right to speak, to assemble, to criticize their government. That's not weakness, that's strength. But there's a line between expression and obstruction, between speech and force, right? And between dissent and the disruption of lawful authority. And the disruption of lawful authority is why a woman by the name of Renee Good lost her life. It's very tragic. And when that line gets crossed, the questions become, well, who enforces the law? And if the answer becomes nobody, then the law becomes just a suggestion. That's why internal stability matters globally. Our allies watch how we govern ourselves. They do. If you don't think we're being watched, our rivals watch how we enforce our laws at home. And if they see hesitation, division, or paralysis, they factor that into their geopolitical strategy. A country that looks uncertain at home looks uncertain abroad. It's that simple. It's that fundamental. And when we put it into practical terms, when a nation struggles to control its borders, its streets, its institutions, it sends a signal. And not just to the people, the citizens of that country, but to the world. And that signal says pressure works. And once pressure works, it gets applied and applied and applied more often. Now, what about the human side in all of this? Because behind every policy debate, there are real people. Families who want safe neighborhoods, businesses that want predictable rules, right? And communities that want trust. They want to trust the system. When law enforcement is weakened or politicized, trust begins to erode. And when trust erodes, cooperation disappears. And when cooperation disappears, enforcement becomes force instead of partnership. And that, my friends, is a very dangerous cycle. So America first, that's you and me. What do we look like here in this approach? If we were talking about all of this, what would the American first approach be? It's not about being harsh, certainly not. It's about being clear. Clear laws, clear consequences, clear authority. A system that people understand, even if they disagree with it, is stronger than a system that no one believes in. Again, health institutions, financial institutions, security institutions, law enforcement institutions, all of them depend on legitimacy, not just power. Legitimacy comes from transparency and accountability and consistency. When those disappear, so does confidence. Confidence in the system. That's what legitimacy requires. And so I want to now turn to children in our society, the future of our republic. What happens when, and I'm just going to call it the screens of society, are the human minds, are children becoming smarter, in your opinion, ladies and gentlemen? Are they more wired than they were? And by wired, I mean just more connected to technology. Surely I think we'd all agree that they are. Are kids getting smarter? Because for most of modern history, the answer was yes. The following generation was always smarter than the previous generation. Every generation on average learned more than the one before it. They read more, they calculated faster, built on what their parents passed down. Progress didn't just show up in machines, it showed up in the human mind. But now, something feels different. Teachers talk about attention that doesn't hold, and parents talk about kids who can swipe, but they can't sit still. Employers talk about graduates who struggle with focus and follow through and basic problem-solving skills. No critical thinking ability. And into that space walks a claim that stops people cold in their tracks, that for the first time in modern history, a generation may be underperforming cognitively compared to the one before it. Now, I want to slow it way, way, way down here because this is where hype and science get tangled up. My job here is not to scare you. It's to teach you how to think about this. First, what do we mean by cognitive? We're not talking about trivia games here. We're talking about things like attention. Can you stay on a task without drifting away? Memory. Can you hold information long enough to use it? Execution function. Can you plan, prioritize, and resist distraction? Literacy and numeracy, right? Can you read? Can you count? Can you reason with numbers? There are studies in the state of Kansas where there are 150,000 kids who've just graduated from high school who can't read at appropriate levels. So we're talking about the mental muscle of a free society, right? It's what let people evaluate arguments and spot manipulation, make long-term decisions, and govern themselves instead of being governed by impulses. It's the intellectual maturity of humanity. But there's some research that's showing some very, very interesting things. And there's growing evidence that heavy screen exposure, especially in childhood, is now associated with shorter attention spans and with sleep disruption, increased impulsivity, and changes in how kids engage with reading and learning and arithmetic and so forth. Important word there, associated. It's not always proven to be the cause, but it's linked, screen time, often enough that serious researchers are now beginning to pay attention to this. And here's what the conversation says, and where I think it gets interesting, because this isn't just about how much time that kids spend in front of a screen. This is about what kind of systems those screens are plugged into. Let me explain that. The television that you had in the 1980s didn't care if you watched it. Your radio in the 1960s didn't track your attention. Your book in the 1920s didn't change the story if you got bored. But modern platforms do something entirely new. They respond to you. They learn. They learn what holds your eyes, what makes you swipe, what keeps you from looking away. And then they give you more of that. Not because it's good for you, but because it's good for engagement. So now attention isn't just a human experience, it is now a commodity. It's bought, it's sold, it's measured in minutes and clicks and watch time. I'll say it again. In the modern economy, your child's attention has a market value. And there are companies, systems, and algorithms competing to capture as much of it as possible. Now let's connect all of that to learning. The human brain didn't evolve for constant novelty. It evolved for focus, repetition, reflection, and pattern recognition. Deep learning happens when the mind stays with something long enough for it to sink in. But engagement-driven systems reward something else, ladies and gentlemen. They reward speed, surprise, stimulation, and constant change. And that creates attention, because what holds attention is not always what builds understanding. A simple example. Reading a book requires holding a mental picture, remembering what happened 10 pages ago, tracking cause and effect over time. Scrolling on a feed requires reacting, swiping, sampling, moving on. One builds depth, the other builds breadth. Both have a place, but they train very different habits within the mind. That's why educators on this particular topic are divided. Now, I used to be a high school teacher. I have a master's degree in curriculum and instruction. And I can see technology as a powerful tool, interactive lessons, access to information, global classrooms, okay, all of that. Others see a system that, when it's overused, though, fragments attention spans, and it weakens the ability to sit. It weakens the ability to sit still, and difficulty then matters. I agree. I see this with screen time, because real learning is oftentimes uncomfortable for us. You don't get algebra the first time. You don't get history in a headline. You wrestle with these things. You struggle with them. You think about them, and you stay with it. So now let's talk about the claim that gets people the most upset. The idea that kids today might be less cognitively capable than previous generations. And the honest answer is that the data on that is mixed. Some measures showed declines in things like reading comprehension and sustained attention. Okay. Other measures show that there are gains in visual skills and digital navigation. Fair enough. So what may be happening is not a simple rise or a fall. It may just be a shift. We're training different kinds of minds for a different kind of world. And that's where the real question lives. Not are kids smarter or dumber, but what kind of intelligence are we cultivating? Because a society optimized for speed and reaction and for stimulation will produce people who are very good at scanning, responding, adapting, and switching. But it may struggle to produce people who are good at sustaining focus, delaying gratification, or long-term planning. Deep moral reasoning becomes an issue because there's not critical thinkers anymore. And those skills matter in a republic. That's why I'm such a big fan of putting back, in school, high school, and maybe even grade school curriculums, philosophy, arithmetic, civics. Philosophy creates critical thinkers, ladies and gentlemen. So I'll tie this back to everything that we've talked about today: health decisions, money systems, foreign policy, law enforcement. All of them assume something about the citizen. They assume a person who can pay attention, evaluate claims, resist emotional manipulation, and think beyond the moment that they're in. A free society doesn't need just laws. It needs citizens with the cognitive strength to use them wisely. And what about, the economics of attention becomes a topic, and that's exciting to me to talk about. I mean, if I were a teacher today, the economics of attention, think about that. What screens might be doing to the human mind, how it affects them, why the system looks the way that it does. Because what we see on screens didn't happen by accident. It happened because attention became valuable. And when something becomes valuable, a market then begins to form around it. So let's start with a simple truth. Most of the platforms that people use every day are free. You don't pay to open up an app. You don't pay to scroll. You don't pay to watch. But free is rarely free. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product. Here's how modern attention economy works. Companies make money by showing advertisements, selling data, and shaping consumer behavior. And to do that, they need one thing above all else: time. Not hours, not even minutes. They need moments, because moments add up. So platforms are designed to answer one constant question: what keeps this person here longer? Fred, hey, we got the team on this? Well, that's it. What keeps people here longer? The question is not for them what helps the person learn, what builds character, what improves their life. Those aren't the questions, just what makes them stay here. And that's where algorithms come in. An algorithm is simply a set of rules that decides what you see next. But modern algorithms don't just follow rules, they learn. And they observe. They observe what you click, what you skip, what you rewatch, and what makes you pause. And then they adjust. Not once, not daily, constantly. So over time, your feed becomes a mirror, not of who you want to be, but of what holds your attention most easily. So now let's talk about dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical in your brain associated with motivation and reward. It's not a pleasure feeling exactly. It's a signal that says, pay attention, this matters. And when something is novel, new, surprising, or emotionally charged, dopamine spikes, and the brain says, more of that. Give me more. The system evolved to help humans. That's a real system within our bodies, and it evolved to help us survive, to find new food, to avoid danger, to get new opportunities. But in a digital environment, novelty is infinite. There's always another video, another clip, another post, another headline, and the brain never gets the signal to stop. So what happens? The threshold rises. What held your attention yesterday feels boring today. So the system shows you something louder, something faster, more emotional, more extreme. Not because it has a point, but because it works. So now let's connect all of this to children. A developing brain is especially sensitive to reward systems. It's still writing a child's brain. It's still writing self-control, focus, emotional regulation, impulse management. And when that brain grows up into an environment of constant stimulation, it learns a lesson early. Discomfort is optional. Boredom is a problem to be solved immediately. Focus can be abandoned the moment something more interesting shows up. Now, that doesn't make kids bad. It makes them trained. Trained by the environment that we built. And here's the part that people don't like to hear. There's no one sitting in a dark room plotting to harm children with regards to this topic. This is not a villain story. This is an incentive story. If a company's revenue depends on engagement, it will optimize for engagement. If attention drives profit, systems will compete for attention. That is how markets work. So when people say, well, why don't they just make healthier content? The answer is uncomfortable, because healthier content doesn't always win in a system that rewards what holds you, not what helps you. A real-world comparison. Fast food didn't take over because people hate vegetables. It took over because it's cheap, convenient, and it's designed to hit the brain's reward center. Digital content works the same way. Quick, easy, emotionally stimulating, and it's everywhere. Now let's talk about the data. Every click teaches the system something about you. What you fear, what you like, what you avoid, what makes you angry. And that information doesn't just shape ads, it shapes content itself. Stories get written to fit those platforms. Videos get made to fit what spreads. Headlines get crafted to fit what triggers. So over time, the culture starts to tilt, not towards what's true, but towards what's engaging. And those two are not always, in fact, very rarely, the same thing. That's where this becomes a civic issue, ladies and gentlemen. A republic depends on citizens who can sit with complexity, hear arguments that they don't like, weigh evidence, and change their minds. But an attention economy, an economy that has only your attention as its goal, thrives on speed, emotion, tribal identity, and reaction. One builds deliberation, the other builds momentum. And momentum is powerful. It can move markets, it can move crowds, and it can move elections. And we can take all of this back to the earlier parts of this program: health narratives, financial confidence, foreign conflicts, domestic law. All of them now live in a media environment shaped by engagement incentives. What spreads is not always what's accurate. What goes viral is not always wise. So the real question isn't just, are algorithms affecting us or influencing us? Of course they are. The deeper question is, what kind of society do we become when our public square is governed by systems that reward reaction instead of reflection? There are moral dimensions to this, because now artificial intelligence can generate content at scale. Not just posts, not just videos, entire streams of material tailored for your engagement, delivered endlessly to you. If you believe one thing, you're going to get that in your feed. And we have to ask, what responsibility do we have as parents, as citizens, as a nation, when machines optimize for clicks instead of character? And so now we talk about something deeper: responsibility. Because the first time in human history, we've built machines that can create culture at scale. Not just distribute it, generate it. Stories, images, videos, voices, entire worlds of content produced not by people with values, but by systems with goals. And the goal almost always is the same: engagement. Artificial intelligence doesn't understand childhood, innocence, meaning, moral development. It doesn't know what a child should or shouldn't see. It knows what gets watched. It knows what gets shared. It knows what holds attention. So when AI is plugged into an engagement-driven platform, it becomes a very efficient machine for producing whatever works, not whatever is wise. Now, that's not an accusation. That is a design reality. A system built to optimize for a metric will optimize for that metric. If the metric is to watch time, you get content designed to stretch watch time. If the metric is clicks, you get content designed to trigger clicks. Value doesn't enter the equation unless someone puts them there. but children, because this is where the moral question becomes unavoidable. A child's brain is not just smaller than an adult's, it's unfinished. It's still getting wired. Empathy, self-control, fear response, trust, identity. And the environment that the brain grows up in becomes part of its structure. So when a child spends hours a day in a digital environment, that environment isn't just entertaining, it's training. It teaches what gets rewarded, what gets ignored, what gets repeated, what gets amplified. And the uncomfortable part of that, a lot of what holds attention, especially for young minds, is bright, fast, emotional, dramatic, sometimes frightening, sometimes confusing. Not because somebody wants to scare kids necessarily, but because those features are powerful at stopping the scroll. So the question becomes, who decides what a child should be exposed to in a system that's automated, personalized, and always on? Is it parents, schools, companies, governments, algorithms? Because right now in many households, the answer is quietly becoming the feed. So let's talk about scale. In the past, if somebody wanted to influence an entire generation, they had to write books, make movies, build schools, right? Train teachers. And that all took time. It took effort. It took accountability. Now, a system can generate millions of pieces of content in a day, tailored to different tastes, delivered to different screens, adjusted in real time. It's not just communication, it is environment creation. And environments shape people. Cities shape behavior, schools shape values, families shape character. And now digital spaces are shaping children. They are shaping childhood. And so that brings us to the moral crossroads. Do we treat digital platforms as neutral tools like books and pencils, or as powerful environments like schools and neighborhoods? Because if they're environments, then I think the people who build them are, in a sense, architects of a childhood. Architects can carry responsibility. They do, and they should. But let me be clear. This is not a call for censorship. This is not a call for bans. This is a call for honesty. Honesty about what these systems do, honesty about what they are designed and how they are designed, and honesty about who they benefit. A simple comparison. We regulate food labels, car safety, medical instructions, building codes, those kinds of things. Not because we hate companies, but because we recognize that systems can harm people even without a bad intention. So the question isn't, should technology exist? Of course technology should exist. The question is, what duty of care comes with building systems that millions of children live inside of every day? Now let's bring it back to America. A free society depends on families. Families depend on trust. Trust depends on knowing who has influence over your children. If that influence becomes invisible, automated, and unaccountable, freedom doesn't disappear in a moment, it erodes quietly away. And here's the deeper danger. When people feel overwhelmed by a system that they don't control, they often look for someone else to control it for them. That's how freedom gives way to regulation. Not through ideology, but through exhaustion. So if we care about liberty, we should care about responsibility first, because a society that governs itself well doesn't need to be governed heavily. And I want to, close this out by talking about something practical, not theory, not technology, but choice. What can parents, communities, and schools and citizens actually do right now to protect cognitive independence in a digital world? Because the future of a free society doesn't just live within laws, it lives in living rooms. We have choice. And we can talk about systems, about power, technology, markets. Your choice is more powerful than all of those. Because in a free society, the most important institution is not a court, it's not a bank, it's not a platform. The most important institution in a free society is family. And so I'll start here. America does not ban its way to strength, and it doesn't mandate its way to wisdom. It teaches its way to those things. And teaching doesn't start in classrooms, it starts at kitchen tables. It starts in a living room, and it starts with conversations that don't fit into a notification box, right? So what does an American response look like here? Not a policy paper, it's not a regulation, but a culture of attention, a culture that treats focus, reflection, and self-control as strengths, not as an inconvenience. And so parents, because no algorithm knows your child, no platform loves your child, no system worries about your child's future, you do. And that gives you authority that no institution can replace. And here are some practical human things that still matter in a digital age. Reading together. Boredom without a screen to deflect your boredom. Long conversations. Real responsibilities. Unstructured playtime and quiet time, prayer time. Folks, those things don't show up in metrics. They don't go viral, but they build something much more durable than engagement. They build character. All right, now let's talk about schools. Education is not just information transfer. If it were, the internet would have replaced teachers years ago. Education is formation. It's learning how to struggle with ideas, how to listen, and how to listen with the intent to understand, not to listen with the intent to respond. How to speak, how to disagree without destroying something, and how to stay with a problem when the answer does not come easily to you. So a classroom should be one of the few places left in society where attention is protected, where a student can sit with a book, a student can sit with a question or a thought without 1,000 competing signals trying to pull them away. Now let's talk about community, because families don't raise children alone, all right? They just don't. Neighborhoods matter. Churches matter. Clubs matter. Mentors matter. All of them create moral weather, if you will. that we have to navigate. They create an environment where certain behaviors feel normal and others feel out of place. And that moral weather shapes people more than any app ever could. And so I'll bring it back to the bigger picture. We talked about health sovereignty, economic independence, national security, institutional power. All of those rest on one quiet assumption: that citizens can think, that they can pay attention, that they can weigh evidence, that they can resist emotional manipulation, and that they can make long-term choices. If that assumption fails, no system can save a free society. Because freedom doesn't collapse when a law is passed. It collapses when people stop agreeing with or understanding. Now, here's where I want to leave you. My friends, this is not about fear. This is about confidence. Confidence in the idea that human beings are not just consumers of content. They are creatures of meaning. We are parents who are not passive bystanders. We are stewards. We are teachers, not facilitators. We're guides. And, citizens are not data points. We are members of the foundation of this republic. And so, part of what I think about when someone says America first, in this context, it means putting families before systems, communities before platforms, and character before clicks, and wisdom before speed. It means recognizing that the most important border that we defend is not on a map. The most important border that we defend, ladies and gentlemen, is around the human mind. And so, ladies and gentlemen, a free nation is not built by machines. It is built by people who can think clearly, speak honestly, choose wisely. And that is not a technological problem. That is a human responsibility. Don't you agree we should have philosophy back in the school system, ladies and gentlemen? It's kind of a philosophy class here today. But thank you very much for spending time with me today, ladies and gentlemen. And please do head over to YouTube and subscribe to my YouTube channel over there, at The Right Side, Doug Billings. At The Right Side, Doug Billings. If you like this program, please share it and come by often. Leave a comment. I would love to hear from you. The Right Side with Doug Billings, ladies and gentlemen. We are in this thing together. Believe it. For the Republic. Cheers.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the set of my show, Doug Billings. Hey, my good friends at EMP Shield, that's electromagnetic pulse, in case you're from Raytown, Missouri. Electromagnetic pulse could wipe out your home electrical system, could wipe out your vehicle. And thanks to the radical liberal agenda that was put forth under Administrator Biden and Vice Pretender Harris, there are lots of people in this country who want to do us harm. And maybe an EMP device would be their chosen weapon. But EMP Shield gives you a device that can protect you. This little baby here goes on your home outlets, a computer, a router, whatever you want to protect. And then they also have a larger model like this. You can still hold it in the palm of your hand, that goes on your vehicle battery so that you can get out of trouble from point A to point B. EMPshield.com. Promo code Doug, ladies and gentlemen. Save yourself. Save your property. EMPshield.com. Promo code Doug. We're in this together, folks. Believe it. For the Republic. Cheers.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.